Okay, so we want to welcome everyone back to Ivy League Murders. And
is this recording? Okay, we are recording. Okay.
Yes. Okay. So we're gonna start. We're gonna do our intro, and then we're gonna introduce you, Zach.
Okay.
Okay. So welcome everyone back to another episode of Ivy League Murders. And we want to, before we start our episode, we want to thank a few people. We've been pushing our Buy Us a Coffee, which is a great way to show your support for Ivy League Murders. You go to buymeacoffee.com, or the link is on our Facebook page. And for $5 or as many cups as you like, you can help support our podcast. And we want to thank, we had a few anonymous donors this week. And then we had a special donor who's my cousin, who, Sarah, I never knew was such a true crime fan until we started this podcast. And he's been like one of our number one supporters. And he was extremely generous with us this week.
And that's Justin.
And that's Justin O'Leary. And he's also huge advocate of law enforcement. So just want to give him a shout out. And this week's case, Sarah, is we're kind of back to Cambridge
And Boston.
And
Laura.
Boston.
And we usually begin our episodes by, telling you a brief history of the university, but we're back to Harvard because, as we know, most of our cases take place at Harvard for whatever reason. And so, but this week we thought we would change it up a bit. So, and in this episode, we're going to be going back to the 1800s, actually in the middle of the 19th century. And we also have the pleasure of collaborating with Zach DeBacco from Drinks with Great Minds in History. How you doing, Zach?
Good. How are you, ladies? Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
It's our pleasure.
So let's just give a little bit of a background to the listeners about Boston during that time. Zach, can you kind of fill us in a little bit about what was going on in the middle of the 19th century?
I can do my very best. When you guys said that ladies, UK, if I say guys, force of habit, I guess. But when you both asked me, if I could walk you through what it might be like to be a 19th century Bostonian kind of walking down the street, it instantaneously reminded me of one of my students' questions that I could have no way of really knowing because I've only been to Boston once and it wasn't in the 19th century. But the reality is, I kind of, as a teacher, you learn to kind of think, well, what do I know and how does it apply? So some things that came to mind, for me is just like, what would it be like to walk down 19th century Boston? Kerosene lit streets, cobblestone brick roads, carriages everywhere. Boston is like a city on a hill, and it seems like it's a city on many hills, is it not?
It is.
Yes, and it seems like each hill thinks they're better than the other hills. What I'm getting from our conversations. But, to me, that was only part of it, the physical, what you see. And I kind of tried to look up some pictures of it, and you can see picturesque scenes of people on hillsides looking at the seascape as ships pour into one of the busiest ports still in the United States. So, you would see that. But also, I kind of thought, what do I know about the 19th century world in the United States? And we as a country were entering into the industrial age more and more, and cities were becoming taller. Cities were becoming fuller. And one of the main reasons, of course, was for immigration, which I know is something you want to talk about later. But every city had similar problems that they had to address in the early 1900s that were brought on in the mid to late 1800s. Tenement houses filled with the urban poor suffering from disease and sickness. So walking down the streets of Boston probably wouldn't have smelled too great in the 1800s.
Yeah.
And it would have been full, depending on what street you walk down, of the poor and in many ways the suffering, the laborers and the immigrants. But not the people we're talking about today, I don't much think. So,
Which brings us to talk about some terms we thought we might familiarize the listeners with, because if you're from steerage class like my ancestors, you may not be familiar with the Boston Brahmin, which is something we're going to be talking about in this episode. So we actually have one of our own here. So our own Boston Brahmin. So I'm going to let Sarah explain to you, the listener, a little bit about what it means to be a Boston Brahmin.
Well, Brahmin is a term that was kind of coined by Boston. It's Boston Brahmin. And so the Brahmin, it was a phrase that was it was coined basically by the Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. And it really is kind of Boston's most elite members. You know, a lot of them are associated with Ivy League, if not Harvard itself. I am a Boston Brahmin on my mother's side. Purely Irish potato farmer on my dad's side, but that's another matter.
A mixing of the social classes there.
So I really straddle this particular episode, and you'll see why. But the term Brahmin was actually taken by the English from the Indian. The Brahmin were like the higher in the caste system. The Brahmin were the higher caste, basically. And so our subject today is Dr. George Parkman, and he was definitely a Brahmin. He was from one of Boston's wealthiest and most influential families. He went to Harvard, and he was, in fact, Harvard's single largest donor at the time. And Parkman became a prominent doctor, a philanthropist, and a landowner. He actually specialized in mental health. And that was because of his own family's history, I guess, from what I could gather. So Parkman was a very distinctive figure in Boston. You know, he was tall and thin, and he walked with his hands sort of clasped behind his back, and he had this prominent chin that he jutted out as he walked. And it also, his reputation preceded him. Parkman was very wealthy, and he was also a notoriously thrifty guy. He refused to employ any more people than was necessary. He went around and he collected, rents on his own properties. And he wouldn't even pay the expense of a horse, which was the only mode of transportation at the time. But he was also generous to people who needed it. And he didn't charge his patients who couldn't afford, basically his house calls. And he was sort of, I kind of picture him as being kind of a grumpy Robin Hood in some ways.
Yeah, because he's kind of a slumlord in a lot of ways.
I picture Ebenezer Scrooge, and I mean like Mickey Mouse Disney version Ebenezer Scrooge running around. And then in the end, he has his nicer sides for certain people, but I just feel like he wanted to be successful in himself.
And that particular combination of like super wealthy and super like thrifty is such a New England kind of thing. I think that's what Dr. Parkman was all about.
It's the times too. So if you don't mind me chiming in,
yeah, please do.
One of the things at the time is that you were supposed to be a social Darwinist in the mid to late 1800s, a person who, only the survival of the fittest, the rich, the powerful survive. And, people, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, Parkman's just a smaller version of those people. He wasn't that rich, but he owned land in Ohio, in Michigan, I believe I read, all over the United States. So he was a wealthy landowner, not just in New England, but kind of like he had investments elsewhere. So he's a pretty big name there. But one thing that stood out to me about Parkman, and if you're going to talk about this later, feel free to edit it out, but is that when he finished his degree, like many people did in the United States, they traveled to Europe to see what Europeans were doing. And you brought up the mental health, and I thought it was really interesting. He didn't go to the regular hospitals and stuff. He spent most of his time visiting mental institutions and asylums, which I thought was so cool about him as a character, even though he's not going to be kind of the character of the story from what I've gathered in a certain sense. But go ahead.
No, I was going to say that they generally call those gentlemen's tours. Mm-hmm. So that's what the upper classes did when they graduated from these schools. They went on a gentleman's tour of Europe, and it's true. He didn't go and visit castles and casinos and Monte Carlo. He was at asylums and looking at different ways to treat mental health that were really cool. Revolutionary at the time.
Yeah, because psychology as a field even is like starting to creep in at this moment in time, and it's so crude, and it's. But you guys did say you'd call me out if there was a Boston pronunciation. I said so. I'm not calling you out, and you can change this or if you want. But I did want to say something. There are two Oliver Wendell Holmes. The one that was mentioned earlier, the Chief Justice, is actually the son of Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. And what I noticed was that it was actually he who coined the term Boston Brahmin. both would have been members of the Brahmin, but I didn't know if you found other research that showed that it was the Chief Justice that said it or not.
Oh, okay. No, we'll clarify that definitely. Yeah. Good.
Yeah. My research was that it was Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. He wrote regularly for Atlantic Monthly, and he coined the term the Brahmins of Boston, and certainly
Very cool.
Like you said, he and his family were one of them for sure.
Okay, good.
Absolutely.
Good call.
And so Dr. Parkman, he was a pretty fastidious guy. And so when he did not return home on Friday, November 23rd in 1890, I have to turn on the light. Pardon me for 1 second. Let's do a little redo on that. I don't have my glasses with me.
Do you want me to talk more about the Brahmin later or now, or when does that fit in?
I think we're good on the Brahmin, actually, if that's okay. We can pull it in with the immigration stuff when we talk about the Irish immigrants in contrast. If that
Absolutely,
if that makes sense.
When do you want me to talk about this?
Wait.
Yeah, we should have we missed. Maybe we should go back. We missed the part where we did alumni and where Zach introduces his beer.
Okay, you want to?
We don't have to go back. We can just
not go back. We could just do it now.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. All right. So
this week, as we, in typical form, we always do famous alumni from the school that we're doing, and this was kind of a challenge, I have to say. If Harvard Medical School isn't to find people that are well known by the general public wasn't the easiest task, but we found a few, right, Sarah?
Yeah, we sure did.
So Michael Crichton, who wrote Jurassic Park, amongst many, many other works, went to Harvard Medical School. Charles Krauthammer, if a great thinker, more of a conservative pundit, but generally beloved thinker. Jill Stein, the feminist.
Yeah, and William James, the philosopher. So,
and the infamous Dr. Sharp, who will be a later case for us, also went to Harvard Medical, and we thought this would be a great time for Zach, since his podcast is called Drinks with Great Minds in History. And Zach, what do you have a drink each week with your guests? Why don't you tell our listeners how
Oh yeah, sometimes it's just me. Sometimes I have guests on. It kind of flops every other week, but I drink as much as humanly possible. As the show says, it's kind of a reason to drink for me, as my little jingle goes. But actually, my college mentor is a Harvard alum, PhD alum, by the way. But on that note, so I drink something every week. So I asked the ladies if I could bring a beer to the show. And I kind of did a twofold here. I did a Sam Adams. Of course, I had to because we're talking about Boston. But I also did Oktoberfest because that's what my last episode happened to be about, the history of Oktoberfest. But I also decided to represent my college alum here, my college, my alma mater, which is Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. Not an Ivy League, but, whatever.
Well, shout out to Duquesne alumni.
So I'm going to start from the top here. So Dr. Parkman, to get back to the case, Dr. Parkman was a fastidious man, and when he didn't return home on Friday, November 23rd, 1849, initially it was thought that he was delayed on his daily rounds.
And, it was a little bit different back then, Sarah, right? I mean, we're talking about before the telephone. And so if you were late, you could take some time for someone to get a note to your home or to send a messenger. So it really wasn't until the next day, when Parkman still hadn't returned, that alarm bells kind of began to go off and Boston authorities were brought in. So where was Parkman? This was kind of irregular, and police started their inquiries, and they were pretty baffled. Parkman, who was quite thrifty, had left a head of lettuce he had purchased behind at a small retailer, and he had asked him to just hold on to it for a few hours and he'd be back to pick it up. And this was quite out of character.
It was quite out of character. And this was a real, a fresh head of lettuce was a real luxury in Boston in November to get this. So this was not like Parkman to leave something like this behind.
Yeah,
You
I
can't
mean,
just go to Walmart and get a head of lettuce anytime you want.
Exactly.
I was like, why is that such a luxury? I was like, who cares? But I
right.
get it now. It's the winter. Yes.
Right. When Sarah said that to me, it took me a minute to even kind of get into that reality. And, there were, the wild, it just seemed like he had kind of vanished into thin air. And there was all kinds of speculation as to what happened to him. And
they in the course of their inquiries, they found out that he had a 1:30 like afternoon appointment with somebody, but no one could tell the police who that appointment was with, basically. And so there was wild speculation. I mean, when Dr. Parkman did not come home the next day, there was all kinds of speculation. And some of them were basically, and you can talk about this a little bit too, Zach.
Hmm.
The Irish immigrants were the first suspects in this. It
Yes.
must have been
Yes.
somebody, from that corner of Boston.
Yeah.
And the speculation about it was that Parkman had been robbed, because he's going around and he's collecting rents. He's carrying around quite a lot of money. That he had been robbed and murdered and thrown into the Charles. And in fact, the police even dragged the Charles River looking for him. Someone matching Parkman's description had been seen crossing the bridge from Boston to Cambridge in the company of kind of like this unsavory character, which means Irish.
Yeah.
And there was, as you've said, there was a lot of tension between the native Bostonians and the influx of Irish immigrants. At this time, and Zach, maybe you can speak to this. I mean, there were signs all over the place saying, Irish need not apply. They did, and so can you tell us a little bit about, about what was going on with the Irish influx in Boston?
I sure can. So the Irish were actually a member of the what historians call old immigrant group. Northwestern Europeans, some French, some English, but mainly Irish, Scots-Irish. And they're coming over primarily for two reasons. Coming over for work, the railroad, especially as railroads pop up everywhere, but the Transcontinental Railroad, as we move through the 50s into the 60s, that's going to draw a lot of Irish over because there's a lot of available work. And about half the railroad was built by, the Transcontinental Railroad was built by Irish immigrants. But the main reason that they're coming over is to escape famine. So, more than 1 million people had died in Ireland in the 1840s, about 1845 to 1849. Excuse me one second. Sorry. Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought my wife needed. Anyway, so from 1845 to 1849, lost my place. So yeah, okay. So the big deal is the Irish potato famine. I'm so sorry, ladies. In the 1840s, 1845 to 1849, millions of people are dying, and it actually leads many Irish to leave the country and come to the United States. And this causes a massive influx of people specifically into Boston and other port cities on the northeastern coast by, proximity and relation. But I think your original question was, why was there such a resentment, such a disdain between the people who lived in the United States at the time and the Irish that were coming over? And I think one reason is that it goes back to English and Irish relations. And many of these Brahmin families were the original English colonizers and settlers in the New England area. And their families could trace themselves way back to the 1600s. But English and Irishmen, I don't know that they get along today that much, but I know that back then there were a lot of historical resentments still lingering. So when the Irish would have come over, these old English colonizing families would have probably seen themselves as above the Irish. But even on a larger scale, terms like nativism, this idea of kind of like America first, and xenophobia, which is not a technical phobia in the psychological sense, but xenophobia, this irrational fear of other cultures coming into yours and causing some sort of melting pot identity that the Brahmin probably just didn't want. So what tends to happen is you see communities putting up these no Irish need apply signs, say natural kind of segregation happening, not legal, but kind of natural. And when I talk about those tenements and the urban poor, like you said, when we talk about these, people that you would just blame, they're the Irish in this period. The urban poor are going to be, the people suffering are going to be the Irish immigrants, and they would have been cast to the side, given the worst jobs, and not really cared for by the people around them, mainly because of that resentment. But one interesting thing that might fit in here too is why Boston? And like I said, it's proximity.
Right.
Why did any European is going to be very close to Boston? It's going to be the quickest boat ride over. But the question often becomes from my students, from people, why stay in Boston, especially if you're not having good living conditions and if the people hate you there? And the answer is you can't afford to leave. All right. So people would stay in Boston because that's all the further they could get. And then you would move maybe to the next city or the next city after that. But really, if you landed in Boston, New York, or whatever port you landed in, you weren't making it very far after that. And that's kind of like, really where that fits. And there's a natural caste system developing just because of immigration. So it might have been a little longer than you want me to go. So
No,
that's
fine.
That's no, and I did look this up too. At the time, Boston actually had its fair share of crime, like even violent crime. But this again would have been in the poor neighborhoods and definitely not in like these Harvard circles that we're talking about.
Right.
And I think it's also important to say, and I think this is true today even, is that Cambridge is somewhat synonymous with Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
So Cambridge kind of has the power and control. I mean, the city.
They're the same thing to me. I get what you're saying. They are synonymous. 100%.
I mean, they kind of Harvard kind of runs Cambridge, and they did then, and they still do.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it is kind of in our story a little synonymous, and we'll see that more as we go along.
And then back to
Parkman.
Back to Parkman. So as they're conducting their investigation, Parkman was last seen entering Harvard Medical School. And suspicion, of course, fell on the school's janitor, Ephraim Littlefield, since he lived in the school with his family. So Littlefield was kind of a gambler. He had, procured bodies for the medical school. And this had cast Littlefield in a less than favorable light in the eyes of the police. He was, in their eyes, a gambling man, a peddler of flesh, and a body snatcher. So let's talk about body snatching, guys, because it's a fascinating.
This is pretty interesting because medical schools needed cadavers to teach their students, and there was a shortage of cadavers. And in places like Boston at the time, they were taking. Were they unclaimed bodies, Zach? They were taking. The Irish Catholics started to really object to this.
Irish Catholics are going to like that anyway, because that's disrespecting the dead. There's no way around that. My grandmother would literally turn her eye at that. She would not be happy. She would not be happy with that. Yes, absolutely. She'd be like, I don't want to talk about that. But the reality is, if I was a guessing man, and I don't have a lot of proof on this, that the bodies they were snatching were probably bodies of the poor. And the poor would have been the Irish, which would mean that the people who just buried their loved ones were seeing their family's bodies snatched for research, which they didn't necessarily want to happen. One thing that I came across that was interesting is that the government of Boston, I believe, or Cambridge at least, had actually passed a law that said any unclaimed body in the prisons, you can have Harvard. You can just take them. And that was common, I think, in Europe and the United States. If there's an unclaimed body of a man who was disliked by society in the first place, then you can have it and use it for research, but that's not enough. They need more bodies, like you said. So these body snatchers, these grave robbers, they would kind of just, take what they could find and get access to without getting in trouble. And I don't have any numbers or anything like that, but it seemed common enough by the Harvard elite that it was kind of enough to freak me out a little bit that they were taking that it was that common.
And they were getting a lot of bodies from New York, actually. And so about a year before Parkman's disappearance, there was a woman who she was a victim of a botched abortion, basically a young woman. And so her body got procured by Littlefield. He brought it to Harvard Medical, but then the people doing the autopsy on the body figured out what had happened to her and how sort of quote, fresh the body was.
Oh,
They notified the authorities, and it was kind of a big scandal at the Harvard Medical School,
yeah.
before, and they got kind of a bad reputation, even though they did the right thing. They notified the authorities and didn't try to hide the fact that this young woman, basically, but it was kind of a scandal ahead of this case that we're talking about right now.
What I found interesting was, a lot of the bodies were procured. It involved bribery, and so medical students at that time had to pay like a $5 fee. And it was really like a body snatching fee you had to pay
It's
as a
true.
medical student. Like
$5 would have been a lot of money. Yeah.
that would have been a lot of money in 1850,
40,
49.
50,
Yeah. But that would have, so you basically, that was a built-in fee at Harvard Medical, was this fee that would go towards basically bribing people to get cadavers.
That's right. And this sort of had all come out. It was kind of scandalous. There was definitely a spotlight on Harvard Medical School, but keep in mind, I mean, this is the last place that Parkman is seen going into. So obviously they put the spotlight on the janitor Littlefield, and he was pretty cooperative with the police. And that, he told them, hey, look, I heard arguing that night. And he sort of became less of a suspect and more of a witness at that point. And so the police went and they searched the medical school twice, actually. But this is a difficult. They're looking for evidence of foul play against Parkman, but the Harvard Medical School is dealing in cadavers. So you're talking about blood, you're talking about vials of blood, you're talking, all the things that come along.
It's like looking for a body in a funeral home.
Yeah.
The perfect place to commit a crime. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
No suspicion in seeing blood, body parts, a tooth here and there.
That's
especially in those days where I don't think they were quite as sanitary with the disposal.
I guarantee they weren't.
Yeah, exactly. But the whole point is, like, cadavers are coming and going out of out of this institution. And the guy who was there, who was a colleague of Dr. Parkman, Dr. John Webster, he kind of cheerfully showed the police around. But again, they search it twice, and they also do find out that Parkman's 1:30 appointment. Remember, Parkman had that 1:30 afternoon appointment with somebody, and they find out it's this guy Webster. But so they talk to Webster, and he says, yes, I saw Dr. Parkman that day. He left. I haven't seen him since. I have no idea where he went. Good day, gentlemen. Of course, if I hear anything, I'll come right, I'll bring it right to you. And, at the same time, so the janitor Littlefield was suspicious. So there's a couple of things. The day that he had heard arguing coming from the lab, and he had also been locked out for several hours that same day, which was unusual because he was a janitor. He had, a lot of cleanup duties and that kind of stuff. And he also noticed that John Webster's behavior was really off as well. Webster was kind of like flush with like money and enthusiasm. And so what does he do, Laura? He offers to buy the Littlefields, because the Littlefields live in the basement of the medical lab. And
how eerie. They live in the basement of a cadaver-filled medical lab with their family.
Yeah. But he offers to buy them a turkey.
Yes.
Because Thanksgiving is approaching, and it's like from a really good purveyor, like food purveyor in Boston. And I think Littlefield kind of looked at this like, is this a payoff from, from this guy Webster?
And Webster's Brahmin, right? I mean, he's big Boston Brahmin.
Yeah, I was going to
Daniel Webster. The Webster name alone is a New England name even I know. So
yes,
right.
I was going to say let's talk a little bit about who Webster was.
Sure.
Let's talk. Yes, Webster was Brahmin, and he actually had inherited a lot of money, and at one time had lived in a mansion in Cambridge. He had gone to Harvard and Harvard Medical as well. He was Harvard legacy, and however, he had squandered his money. And it was interesting that at the time, Harvard professors were not paid well. However, it was expected that it would be the elite teaching the elite. So they were expected to lead very elite lifestyles. So
And just kind of be financially independent, basically. You know,
Teachers
be
still
able
get paid terribly,
to
just in case.
afford to teach at Harvard, basically.
Yeah. I wish I could afford to teach at my school.
So
Yeah.
once Webster had squandered through his inheritance and was stuck with just a smaller mansion in Cambridge, God no.
Poor guy.
He was left only with his Harvard salary, and had lived beyond his means so long.
Just
He
to
began
mention too, I'm sorry to cut you off, but a smaller mansion in Cambridge is probably worth like 6 million these days.
Wonderful. Yes. To suffer.
Right?
Oh,
Yeah, to suffer like that.
Right. If we haven't mentioned it, we're from Cambridge.
yeah. And it's interesting. I think maybe to put it in historical perspective for everyone, these Brahmins, these elites, they're not people you've never heard of. They are people that every American knows. The Adams family would have been descendants of these Brahmins, the Laus, the Cabots. I mean, these names, they're big colonial history names. And the Brahmins aren't just run-of-the-mill people like George Parkman, who, unless you've heard of this case, you might not have heard of today.
And you'll hear more names as we go forward, like Choate, who established Choate Rosemary Hall, who was, so you'll hear these names in this case, both literary, and political names that were quite important names. And I won't get ahead of myself, but there's quite a few big names to come.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, yes. Yeah. Continue on.
Well, so the janitor Littlefield is suspicious, and here's where we come to the kind of like Hitchcock part of this case. I love this. So it was the day after Thanksgiving, and all the professors are gone. Webster's gone. Littlefield has he just has a really bad feeling, and what he knows, there's one place in the lab that has not been searched, and that's a privy that is kind of off of, I think it's off of Webster's like office
which is, like, to those who don't know, it's a toilet, but
right.
it's
a bathroom,
an old 1800s toilet, so it's kind of like a nice outhouse.
Regularly, yes.
But emptied into the Charles.
Right, that's right. But he's fearful that Webster is going to come back, even though the sort of, think people have cleared out for the holidays and everything like that. So what he does is he takes these tools and he starts breaking into the privy, which has been locked. It's never been searched by the police. But he tells his wife, hey, grab a hammer. If you see Webster coming back, hammer, basically, so that I could hear the hammer going, so that I know to get out of there. And so he does. He breaks through the privy wall, and he finds a human thigh. And so at this point, he freaks out, and he goes and he finds a guy named Professor Bigelow. And he tells Bigelow, who's immediately suspicious, once again, of Littlefield himself. And so.
I mean, I just find this so interesting because we often talk about kind of the town and gown thing. And in this case, it's a little town in town, but you see it here. I love the way all these intellectuals think they're so much smarter than the janitor. And then, like, they all go home for Thanksgiving, and like the janitor's got the intuition that nobody else has. Yeah. And he discovers the body. Yeah. So it's like town 1, gown 0.
Well, he discovers a part of a body.
Right.
He discovers a human thigh.
Right.
They're not sure. They're not sure it's Parkman, by the way, but all they know is that a body part does not belong.
Right. They know
in this privy.
Right. There's no reason that there would be remains in the privy. So they do know that. And, so obviously, we have a missing person, and we have, a body found. So the police put 2 and 2 together, and, the rest isn't very hard for them to pull together when they start to look at Webster's debt. And
hold on 1 sec. We're jumping ahead of ourselves again.
Oh, we are?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So sorry about my colleague here. She's
It's okay.
I'm joking. No, so let's just back up a little bit.
Okay.
Because so the police come in and they search again, basically. And what they not only find the thigh, they also find in a really weird place, like in a box of like, where it shouldn't belong, a human torso. And it has a human thigh stuck in the middle of the torso.
Is this like the creepiest office building ever?
Yeah.
For Halloween.
I know there's like bodies in the toilet and like thighs in the closet.
Awful, and so eventually they also, but they again, all they know is that, and they ask Littlefield about it. Hey, look, they don't know. They're like, do body parts belong in the places that we're finding them? And he's like, no, absolutely not. And so they eventually find they're still not sure it's Parkman. They have they're very suspicious now of Webster. And he's the last person that saw Parkman that day. They are finding places that he had, not disclosed to them. And so they, and again, so they conduct this ruse with Webster. And because also there's different jurisdictions. There's Cambridge and there's Boston. Webster lives in Cambridge rather. And so they go to Cambridge and they say to Webster, hey, we need to look at something else in the lab. Can you help us out? And so Webster goes with them. And they are not going to the lab. They're trying to get him into the Boston jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm.
And the police say, hey, we have to stop by the police station and get something. And they arrest him basically in Boston.
And the police had gone through a pretty big reform in this era too. I believe I read something like the police have been like run by criminals for the past few decades. And now all of a sudden now they've completely like revamped and just made them regular cops all of a sudden. So it seems like this case is falling at a weird time where the police actually are capable of doing a job.
Yeah, it appears they did quite a thorough job, and they, they checked everyone out fairly and equally. However, when Webster was arrested, there was great uproar in the immigrant community and riots ensued. I mean, the police had to be brought in at Harvard Medical School, which actually, just so people understand the proximity, is not in Cambridge, it's in Boston. And because they were so angry that they had been blamed, the immigrant community had been blamed, and here it was one of their own who was actually the suspect.
Exactly. And Webster, so there was some hinky stuff going on with Webster financially too. They had discovered in conducting their investigation of Webster that he was kind of, he had this box of minerals, I guess, which was fairly valuable. And he had taken out loans on the promise of this box of minerals, but he had double dipped, basically. He had used this valuable box of minerals, and he was in debt. He was in hock to a lot of people, and Parkman was one of them. And so I want to also get back to the fact that they still, in their searching of the building, they actually found a jawbone in the furnace. And what was in our research, what we found out, I thought was really interesting, was that they got Parkman's dentist to come in and actually identify the jaw, given his very specific dental work, because he had all these like fancy bridges, very expensive dental work. He had very bad teeth, Dr. Parkman did. So they had, fake teeth at this time were like, I feel like they were basically made out of wood. These weren't, they were porcelain. They had, but where the missing teeth were and that kind of thing, they could make a real identification to Parkman.
Yeah, I heard this thing like Parkman refused to give up the last 3 teeth.
He had 3 left.
And that's what made it so identifiable.
Distinctive.
Yes, yes,
Exactly.
thank you. Yeah, that's a way better word than identifiable.
And I think it's kind of important as we kind of get ready to go into this trial, and that's where we're at now. Um, so Webster's been arrested, and he's now choosing an attorney, and he is actually turned down by several attorneys, including Choate, who is later going to establish Choate Rosemary Hall, which is a very exclusive
Oh,
boarding school, if as people who aren't familiar with it, um, because Webster would not accept his guilt,
mhm.
and he was encouraged to accept his guilt and take, a self-defense plea or an
Or
insanity. But many say due to, his family, he insisted on his innocence. And interestingly enough, he had a great deal of support from his, from his
From the Brahmin,
from the
right?
Brahmin. I mean, it's actually easier to find a nice thing said about him than about Parkman.
Right.
which is kind of but I found it interesting that even Longfellow's wife was writing in, and so in support of Webster, and the dean of Harvard said never could a Harvard man commit such an act.
That's right. And that does go back to your point, Laura, about that there were actually first of all, this case in Boston, and actually kind of the nation, I think, was crazy. The press went crazy with this. And in fact, the Boston Herald even published pictures, like pretty gruesome pictures of, the body parts that were found. And these became so valuable that people would actually swipe the newspapers off of other people's doorsteps to resell them. There was such a fascination, I think, with this case,
Mhm.
but also a lot of anger, again, by the poor, mostly Irish immigrants who felt like they had been unfairly targeted because there was no conception that one of Harvard's own could have killed the other. So
And it's interesting that you brought up the kind of celebrity status of this trial, because we talked about how news traveled slowly. We brought this whole picturesque story of 19th century Boston, no telephones, but they did have the telegraph. So news could have traveled from Boston to other major cities fast enough that it could get this kind of like notoriety in that
Sure.
sense. But it's not like at the tip of your fingers. It's like at least within the tip of a few days, I guess, is the information could spread not to rural communities, but you're right, cities from all over the world looking at this, I'm sure, like, how could the wealthy, educated, civilized elite ever commit such a heinous act? And I think that's exactly what you're trying to say.
But it was quite
oh, sorry.
it was quite shocking. And I mean, we see Dickens, I think it was, several years later on his trip to the United States, his first stop is at Boston. And the first place he wants to go is to Harvard Medical School. So, I mean, this really is reaching across the pond. And fascinating. And it's also happening, and maybe you can speak to this a little bit about kind of what's happening with literature. This is kind of like a literary renaissance we're having here at this time and place in Boston.
I mean, I don't know all of the people at Longfellow's there, right? And Melville is there
Well,
too.
Melville's father-in-law is actually the judge.
Oh, okay.
That's his father-in-law.
Never shows up for any of this.
Yes,
right?
he was kind of like the celebrity everybody was like waiting for, who never showed up.
Yeah, what a dick. No,
But Emerson, Longfellow,
Louise May Alcott, Thoreau,
oh yeah.
Hawthorne.
Yeah.
And it's not surprising that this news would travel across the pond, because I talked to you ladies about this idea of the Boston Brahmin. They're centered in the Somerset Club in, I think, Boston or Cambridge or wherever it is. I've come to see them as not atypical. They're not uncommon, but like more archetypal. The Brahmins, they're just Boston's version of the Knickerbocker Club in New York, and they had their brother clubs in Paris, Rome, London. So, and I mean, brother clubs like regular communication. If you were from London coming to New York, and you had a connection to a club in London, you would go to a club in New York,
Right.
and whether it's, the literary movement in with Longfellow and all of them in Boston, or Washington Irving in New York City. These clubs are like where, I don't know if it's the clubs draw in the literary figures or the literary figures make the clubs, but I think you're totally right that this literary scene, the Boston Brahmin, emerges out of that, I think, in a way.
Oh, and they put on, like, Boston went crazy when Dickens came here as well. He was like a mega star,
Right. And
Yeah.
we forget
Okay, yeah.
today, in the age of movies and celebrities, that these writers were celebrities of their day. So
They are, yeah.
we forget that today because we really don't put authors in the same, unfortunately, in the same esteem, except for a few. But
yeah, I mean, these people would be like J.K. Rowling level, like,
yes,
we're talking like every household names. These books would have been read and still are read by everybody. Most of them are still in high school curriculums.
And in fact, Charles Dickens' last novel is it's called The Mystery of Edwin Drood.
Drood, yes.
And it's loosely based on this case. Basically, he died in 1870 and he was unable to finish it. I actually downloaded it. I'm going to listen to it because I loved it.
And another little factoid I'll have to share is during this time, it was, and this was one of the things with Webster was, being insolvent would almost be a reason to lose your job. I mean, being a debtor would be very bad. And Hawthorne was going through a very difficult time. So Emerson was passing a basket for Hawthorne around the time of the trial. And he was getting ready to publish a book. And that book was The Scarlet Letter.
Wow.
So there's really a lot of
one of my favorite classic books.
And Longfellow wrote all about this trial in his journals, which are kept in Harvard, and you can see them.
That's right.
But we'll get back to the case.
And part of the trial, I mean, speaking of sort of town and gown once again, so basically Webster and his brother-in-law, right, try to frame Littlefield for the crime.
Yeah, I mean,
it's part of the defense. It's like they're trying to
point fingers at him.
Right. I mean, he's an easy scapegoat, and they really don't have much of a defense. So their defense is, this is a building full of cadavers, and if it is him, it was him.
Right.
Or if it's not, it's a body amongst bodies. Get over it. We didn't know. We don't. Yeah.
But and keep in mind, there was a $3,000 reward for any information about Parkman, and Littlefield actually won. He actually got that money for helping them out,
which is over 100,000 today.
Which is a king's ransom for someone like
someone in the poor side of it. Right? And it sounds. Getting back to the case and the trial, one thing that you said that stood out to me is that, Webster wasn't indebted to people. He was on the fringe of not being able to support his career at Harvard, meaning he couldn't support himself. And if anything, to me, that says motive for murder, So, and I don't know, was he indebted to Parkman?
Oh,
he was.
He was. Parkman was one of the people he was indebted to.
So that was,
he was just wildly spending beyond his means, basically, beyond his professor's salary, basically.
And at that time, being in debt would be a reason for you to lose your job. You could actually lose your job if you were, proven to be, in debt. So, they could bring that up to the
Thank God those times are over. I'd so be in debtor's prison right now.
Today you have to have an immeasurable amount of debt to have a job. That's how it works.
So Webster finally confesses. Basically, he has sort of like a come to Jesus moment, and he,
Well, that comes a little bit later, and Lemuel Shaw, who is Melville's father-in-law, is the judge, and the prosecution puts on a very good case, and now this is truly a Harvard case. I mean, I found this very, very amusing that on both sides, the defense and the prosecution, everybody but one person went to Harvard, and the one that didn't go to Harvard went to Brown. which so this was Ivy League all the way. Parkman had good attorneys, and the state put on a very good case.
Webster had
good attorneys, and the state put on but this was the first time ever that forensic odontology had ever been used in a case.
Can you say that again? No, just because I want it to be clear on the recording that it was Parkman had.
Okay.
Start again. Sorry, because you. Well, no, you just said Parkman had good attorneys, and
So Webster had
good attorneys.
Yeah, Webster had good attorneys, and this case really was, really very, very much of a revolutionary case legally, because forensic odontology had never been used in a trial before. And
you might want to explain what that means for the dumb folk who didn't go to Ivy.
So that is the study of the dentistry. So they had the founder of Harvard Dental, who came in and testified about the very specific bridge work he had. And, now that's commonplace that we, ID people with dental work. But at the time it wasn't.
Yeah, I don't think if Parkman hadn't had such weird dentures, it wouldn't have even worked, right? I mean,
I think he would have gotten away with it if he didn't have such weird dentures.
It's true. And there's also, but it was actually the first time too that somebody was convicted of murder without a body, without what's called a corpus delicti. So even though there were body parts, the forensic odontologist, the dental expert, was key in identifying that was Parkman. So that was the first time in legal history that somebody had been convicted without a whole body, basically.
And all of these experts, and they're all colleagues. I mean, today this would never be allowed because everybody, everybody was so connected to each other and to Harvard. I mean, they're all very conflicted, so many conflicts of interest here, but it was allowed then. And I forgot what I was saying.
Well, so then let's get to the part where he confesses.
Okay. Well, first we have to have him convicted. So Parkman. So Webster mounts a defense, basically blaming Littlefield, saying it's not Parkman. It's relatively, ineffective. Nobody really believes him, although people in Cambridge and a lot of the Harvard and Brahmin set continue to just have a disbelief that anyone of his breeding could have committed such a terrible act. And I mean, it's speculated that perhaps he would never confess to the crime during the trial to save face with his family. And we know how important the family names were. So he professed his innocence throughout the trial, and he was found guilty. And then there was a lot of speculation about how he would be punished. And nobody thought that they would ever send a Harvard medical doctor to the gallows.
No, absolutely.
I mean, that couldn't happen. And, Judge Shaw had absolute no problem doing it. He sentenced him to death by the gallows.
He did. And I do think, and I'm not sure if we've made this clear, but there was a real, we oftentimes in Ivy League murders, we have a town gown kind of dispute. Well, in this case, it's town, because Cambridge was fully behind Dr. Webster. Boston thought he was guilty as sin and should hang, basically. So there was, it divided down by class. But it also divided by town. Cambridge sided with Webster. Boston absolutely did not.
Yeah, I think it might be better said, because for those of us not from Boston, Boston and Cambridge, to me, they're virtually the same thing. But Boston Brahmin, it's almost not the right name for them, because they're more Cambridge Brahmin. They're more Harvard Brahmin. They are Boston Brahmin from an outside perspective. But they might be Bostonians to us, but to you guys, it kind of seems like you've made the distinction between them. And these people, I think, were blindly loyal to their own, because their existence, their survival, much like monarchies of Europe in this period, it is necessary that people believe that they're elite. So they have to kind of support their own elite status. And, to understand why the Brahmin would stand behind them, that's something I've grappled with in my research for this. When you two asked me to look into the Brahmin, I tried to understand the nature. And one adage, one Brahmin proverb kept coming up that just stood out to me as to how these people could be so loyal to Webster, even though it seems like he really did commit a crime, even though he won't confess, and why he won't confess just to save his family's name. And this, I don't know if you came across it, but it was said by a Brahmin about the Brahmins. And it was, and this is good old Boston, the home of bean and cod, where Laos talk only to Cabots and Cabots talk only to God. And I don't know if you ever come across that, but the Cabots, descendants of old English minister families from the colonial days, the Laos are going to be early industrialists. And what it's basically saying is, if you're not a name, if you're not a family, forget you. But if you are a family, we got you. It's almost mafioso in a way. So that just stood out to me, because in sitting here trying to grapple with that, I just couldn't figure out, why would these people who don't have a reason to care about Webster care to defend Webster's honor, name, and legacy? It's because they're defending themselves.
It's really true. It's something we come up against in a lot of our Ivy League cases too, even to this day, where someone from, the vaulted halls of Ivy League will commit a hideous, crime. And then they kind of get like surrounded by the intelligentsia, who sort of in a weird way protect them, excuse them.
The headline, how could a brilliant person like this commit a crime?
That's right.
Right.
And that's at the core of our podcast, actually.
Yeah.
That question.
And I think it's because they're defending themselves. If one Brahmin commits a crime, are all Brahmins capable of such evil, such heinous acts? I think that's, for me, what it is. Because I really grappled with this in looking at this case for the show.
One thing we say in our trailer is, and we talk about a lot in Ivy League Murders, is there's this real thought that if I send my kids to the right school, if I live in the right city, I'm going to really be protected from a certain element of life. And I think that one of the reasons that people stand behind their own is they really don't want to believe that that's not true, and that you could be sitting next to somebody who might kill you in like Harvard Medical School. Like that kind of human nature, that crosses all socioeconomic paths. And so does.
You can't just blame the Irish. All right.
Okay. Right. Although they did, they have done quite a bit. I'm a McDonald. I can say that about the Irish.
Okay. But get to the confession.
Well, I'll get to the confession. So he's found guilty and he's facing the gallows, and he has exercised all of his appeals, and he's from money. So he has a lot of appeals, and none of them have worked. And he finally confesses, and he confesses to.
He basically says,
he confesses to somebody famous.
George Putnam.
He confesses to Reverend George Putnam, who is very well known, because of course you can't just confess to any old person. He has to confess to if you're a Brahmin, right? You've got to confess to somebody quite famous, and that's what he does. And then we really find out, and what he says happens is that he owed Parkman money, and Parkman threatened to go to Harvard and tell Harvard that he owed him money and have his job taken from him.
And I had heard that Parkman almost got him his job in the beginning.
He wrote a recommendation letter for him.
Yeah, he's like carrot and sticking him, like, you better pay me or else.
Right. I got you this job, and I will, you will lose this job because of me. And in a fit of rage, he hit him. And I think that the part that, I'm not a believer in capital punishment, but, he very easily could have avoided the gallows if he had admitted that early on and said this was, a crime of passion or self-defense, but he wouldn't do that. So that
gave the family name. That was it. Can't plead guilty. In the end, I know he did, like you just said, but
Right, but I'm sure his family had complete denial over that because he pled not guilty at trial. He never, confessed at trial.
That's right. Yeah.
But a little caveat, which shows that there was, and I don't believe that Webster was some type of an evil man. I think that he was a desperate, scared man who kind of flipped out. He asked to see Littlefield before his execution, and he apologized to him, which I found kind of moving.
Yeah.
I don't know how speculative we are on this show, but I just don't buy it with Webster. I think he's a little shadier than people give him credit for.
You think so?
I have no real reason to believe. It might be the booze. I don't know. But it's a product of opportunity. I don't think he wanted to kill Parkman. But then again, the next source that I listen to or hear or read, it says Webster confesses to hitting him once and Parkman died, but the evidence of the body doesn't really seem to show that somebody was only hit once. And then beyond that, he cut him up. To cut someone up, I feel like you should be pretty comfortable with death. And with all the cadavers coming out, I get this vibe that maybe Webster was like hoping that it would just be, another body going through Cambridge.
Oh, I definitely think that was his plan for sure. I think he bludgeons him with this, I think it was a log of some sort.
Yeah,
is that right?
Some piece of wood.
So a piece of wood. And I think he was going to hide the parts of Parkman all around and just kind of process it through. What a perfect alibi, right? But process it through, the autopsy room.
Of course, there's a leg through in Harvard. Why wouldn't there be a random leg? We're doing autopsies,
Yeah, that's right.
I just want to say, this is just so creepy to me how medicine used to be.
Yeah,
I mean, we've really come a long way.
18th or 19th century murder is creepier just by default. I think we picture it in black and white. I think we picture it in these people who. Murder wasn't common. There was no SVU back then. There was no Law and Order shows. It wasn't like in everybody's lives. It was like if you heard about a murder, you were probably never going to hear about another one in your life again.
It wasn't a genre.
No, not at all. Dickens and Longfellow and Washington Irving, they're not writing about murders because that wasn't if it was a thing, it was a thing of myth. It's not a thing of. It's a thing of rare occurrence. The Scarlet Letter, even, that was more the scandal of the day. Perfect example. That's the kind of thing you would write about, not brutal slayings and hacking people up like Webster did. Just my thoughts.
No, I think you're right.
I think you're, and I think that's obviously probably why we're still talking about this case all these years later. And then when you see. You definitely don't expect to see that from a Harvard medical, doctor to cut up another Harvard medical doctor. Well,
I mean, all right, I'm going to push back a little bit on that, though, because you've got Edgar Allan Poe pretty quickly after this. You do have this kind of and you do have the Victorian fascination with the macabre, too. That was very alive and well at the time. So... yeah, I don't think murders like this were commonplace. But what makes this murder so unusual is the victim and the perpetrator at that time, because there was violent crime in Boston, at least there was in London. That Jack the Ripper's not so long after this, maybe, a few years, but yeah, this is definitely a standout kind of case.
This is a standout. I mean, if Littlefield had
society scandal right here, and people love high society scandal.
Exactly.
That's what it is. I mean, it's hard to imagine that now, but this was just kind of like a celebrity case, who was going to show up wearing what of the day and in the 1850s. And that's pretty interesting.
Right. The question was like, will Herman Melville show up? I remember one author, it was just something about this trial just because I wanted to have an idea of what was going on. And it was like, even historians reading this are like, will Melville show up? Did Melville show up in the background just in disguise? And no, Melville just doesn't show up. Because he's a massive Moby Dick about it, So, can it get any cornier than that? I don't know.
That's good.
That's a good.
That's
That's
good. I know. I
wrote
think
that
the Melville sightings,
Right, but
Melville is like probably like the least interesting person to me from my college courses. But
What? I love Moby Dick.
But
Oh, you're crazy.
so like a Melville sighting is just not like a Brad Pitt sighting, but at the
sound like
day it was.
Well, Melville sounds like you'd call somebody like an insult. Like, you're such a Melville. I don't.
Well, if I call you a Melville, it might be an insult. Well, so this has been really fantastic.
Yes, I had a blast.
Absolutely.
Just kind of casual and fun. I thought this would be like a cool case that we could all talk about some history, some murder, some creepiness. And
Yeah.
Zach, we want to play your trailer. And let everyone know to listen to your podcast. It's absolutely I mean, it's really one of my favorites. I mean, it's like a witty history podcast. And
Zach, you are a great storyteller.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And so are you too.
And your Facebook group is like off the hook.
I try my best with the Facebook group. Social media is exhausting. But
I mean, I have friends who are like, a lot of my friends are teachers or our friends who are like addicted to your Facebook group and your podcast. And it's so much fun.
I have a flaw. See, true crime's easy to get like hooked on because it's juicy, but history, everybody always says, I hate history or I love history. And people who hate history just had a bad experience with it. People don't like history to be fun for some reason, and history should be fun. And I'm glad that you two think that I do it that way in the show, because that's what I want it to be. I want my show to be history, fun, and my other love, booze.
And just for all the ladies out there who can't see Zach, and maybe you see Zach's pictures, but Zach's a total cutie pie.
Total hottie.
Like I know, but like he's like the hot teacher you have in high school.
Right now.
Imagine if he was your high school teacher.
Oh my God.
I know. My high school teachers didn't. No, we don't have female listeners.
Hot for teacher.
Hot for teacher. So we're going to play Zach's trailer now. And thanks again, Zach.
Yes, absolutely.
For being on Ivy League Murders this week. And stay safe and stay curious.
That's right.
Cheers.
Cheers. How was that, Joe?
That was great, you guys. The audio was fantastic from start to finish. No skips, no nothing. No.
We might have to edit, like take chunks and move them around a little.
Yeah, like that little alumni thing. We'll have to.
Yeah. I actually wrote down where that happened.
And honest to God, listen, as a fellow podcaster, I don't need any preview. Whatever you put out, Okay, I don't.
Awesome.
It's your show. Whatever you think's best for your show will work. Do you need me to give you my trailer, or can you?
Oh yeah, we need you to give it to us. We should have told you before. We're not organized. What?
Are you on Audrey.io at all?
Mm-mm.
You could just email it to Joe.
Okay, I'll send you. Yeah, I'll just send you the file. That's easiest. And if I don't do it in time, I don't know when you're airing this, but if I don't do it tomorrow, I'll just respond to. Do you want me to send it to Joe or you two?
Joe, if you can just send it to Joe right away.
I'll just reply with that email. I will do that.
Awesome.
Yeah, that was fun. And I edit out that part about Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. You can check it if you want to, but I just saw
Don't
that.
worry about it.
Yeah,
it's
cool.
fine.
Oh, it's fine.
I think it's a good catch.
I think it's fine. I
read it in your notes, and I wanted to say, hey, that beforehand, and then I started talking to Joe about cats, and I completely forgot.
Hey, you're the historian. It's fun. Yeah.
So no, this was very fun. Thanks for having me on. If you ever want to cover the Burr, the first murder case of America, you let me know.
All right.
Burr and Hamilton were the lawyers, I think, on the first murder trial of the United States of America, and they're both, one's Princeton, one's Cambridge.
No kidding.
Columbia.
Oh,
okay. Well, we might have to talk to you about that one.
We'll circle back to you about that one.
No hurry, but Burr is Princeton and Hamilton's what's King's College? Columbia, right? Yes, Columbia.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, we need Princeton.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Burr, yes. So
we're planning Oxford cases and
yeah, wow, okay,
Sorbonne and
yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Even St. Petersburg. too.
Oh, Ivy's abroad. How fun.
And University of Miami.
Oh, yes, there you go. I know.
Of
I had to
course.
represent my
The
college
U.
a little bit because as much as it's
Oh,
not
yeah.
sexy, gotta love the Berg, So for sure. No, thank you so much for having me on. Yeah. It was fun.
Total
Cool. All
pleasure.
right.
Totally
Excellent.
fun. Thanks a million. Great.
Yes, absolutely. Do we sign off? What do we do? And do you need that trailer immediately? Or?
Yeah, immediately would be good.
Okay. You know what? I'll just send it right now.
All right, man. Oh, man.
I know I'm like super pushy, but I used to be a salesperson.
Not pushy at all. And I'll send you.
She's totally pushy. Are you
I
kidding?
mean, I was like the head
Zach, you don't have to be
salesperson.
nice.
Joe, back me up on this. Okay.
Zach, Sarah taught me a long time ago. We don't have to be nice to Laura and humor her.
Laura-
She's very pushy, but we just do it.
You know what? Just do what she says, and there won't be any problems.
Nobody
Exactly.
stole more than me.
I'm so happy for you guys with your growth that you've been having lately, and it sounds like that's awesome. I'll also send in the email a copy. I don't have the citation for it, but to get that picturesque Boston, if you want to post it to your page, or I can share it to your page if you want. It's that harbor view of Boston. If you just
if you share it because you always write such like witty comments whenever you write. I love when you share things to our page.
When is this airing?
What?
When do you plan on airing this?
Right away.
Oh, okay. So once it's out, I'll post that picture and say this was my mindset of Boston.
Yeah. As soon as Joe edits it. Yeah. So
And Joe, can you just send us we're not like Zach. Can you just send us like a rough of it so that I can be totally neurotic about it?
So
Thanks.
Sarah,
1,000,000%. Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect. All right, guys. Thank you.
Great. I'll
Awesome.
have you in the next 10 minutes, Joe.
Awesome. Thanks, Zach. Great to meet you, ladies. We'll talk soon.
Zach, try to make it 8. Okay, just saying.
it's
Hey,
June.
well,